For those of you who may not know, I am the discoverer of hitherto unknown natural phenomena, which greatly aid in the understanding of people, from which I constructed a revolutionary practical philosophic system called Septemics and published it in the book, Septemics, Hierarchies of Human Phenomena. And the subtitle is Analysis, Prediction, and Management of Human Affairs. That is what this book affords you. And you can see there the logo. That is the Septemics logo, which tells you quite a bit. The word Septemics means literally of or pertaining to seven. The logo is a seven-pointed star. Each ray points in a different direction and is a different color. But between them, they make a spectrum. And that's what you get from each of the 35 scales of Septemics, which between them span the spectrum of human experience. I'm ready to go to the individual scales, meaning they apply more to an individual than to a group.
Hi, Jim. Welcome. I'd like to go through the scale of personal influence today. Okay. I've been looking through this, and as you rightly say in your preface, you've got to study the book. You've got to study these scales. It's not something you can cruise through and think you've got it. Give us an overview about the scale of personal influence.
Sure. First, I want to explain that you can influence somebody, for example, by shooting them or hitting them in the head with a club, right? That's the type of influence. That's not what I mean by personal influence. Personal influence is how you influence somebody with your person, which is normally what we expect from people in civilized society. That I'm not going to influence you by robbing you or burglarizing your house. Those are influences. This is how you would interact with a person and thereby influence him. As it says, this is a linear quantum general scale. Linear means there's no apparent congruence between levels 1 and 7, as is the case in a spiral scale. Quantum means there's no intervening level. In other words, you go instantaneously from one level to an adjacent level. You're at level 2, and then you're at level 3. It's like a billionth of a second later. There's no gradation. And general means this is not context driven. This is how a person responds or behaves according to this list. Everyone is somewhere on every list in this book. So everybody utilizes some form of personal influence. These are in the order from most causative at the top to least causative at the bottom. If you look at the axis on the right where the dotted vertical line is, at the top it says cause. So if you are at level 1, that is as causative as you can be. In other words, your influence of the person is a causative influence. If you're at the bottom of the scale, that is a point of effect. You're not a cause, you're an effect. You're influencing somebody, but you're doing it from a point of effect rather than cause. Now, direction. This is another one of the scales that has direction built into it. This has several major implications. So the plus minus does not mean good or bad or add or subtract. It means, in the case of plus, it means outflow, or you might say reach. In physical phenomena, it makes more sense to talk about inflow, outflow, like the water in your pipes. They flow in, they flow out. Whereas in human phenomena, it makes more sense to describe it as reach and withdraw. So when a person is reaching, that's an outflow. And when a person is withdrawing, that's an inflow. So plus means it's an outflow throughout the book. Plus means outflow and minus means inflow. This is extremely significant because what this tells you is people at 1, 3, 5, and 7 are outflowing. And that is a clue to figuring out what level the person is at. Is this person inflowing or outflowing? And when I talk about these levels, you'll see that's actually not hard to figure out. Let's start at the bottom, meaning level 7, martyrdom. Martyrdom is a way to influence people. This is influencing them from humility. This is how Jesus of Nazareth created a gigantic effect on the world. 2,000 years later, 1 billion people are still following him. He did it by becoming a martyr, which is the quintessence of humility. Now, this is an outflow. This might not make any sense to you that this is an outflow, but trust me, it is. because you're outflowing your martyrdom into the public. What could be more at effect than a martyr? When you're being martyred, you are totally at effect. Out from there is victimization. Now, this is very popular in industrialized society today. This is guilt. You influence people by guilt. This is what people mean when they say, he's running a guilt trip on me. This is influencing people by making yourself a victim. This is not as much at effect as being a martyr, but it's still being at effect. So this is the person who goes around on some kind of a trip saying, you did this terrible thing to me. And that's how they influence you. So like the mother who says to the son, oh, you're a terrible son and you should have stayed in college, and running a guilt trip. You're a big disappointment to me and your father, right? The mother is making herself a victim of the son. So this is done in many contexts.
Can I ask you a question here, Jim?
Sure.
Because victimization involves reversing the vector of influence and making, as you say, making the attacker feel guilty for their actions.
Yes.
And that's often seen in ideologies like socialism, portraying
Yes.
poor as victims. How
Yes.
does the method of victimization, where guilt is used to influence, play a role in shaping societal dynamics? And can you give examples of its impact on political or societal movements?
Oh, sure. This is patently obvious in the United States. Probably the most used word in political discourse in the United States is racism. We have Black Supreme Court judges, we have Black generals, Black secretaries, our stars who we idolize are Black, but they keep saying racism. It's just a guilt trip. They run this guilt trip on them. Now, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves in 1863, and shortly thereafter, a couple of years later, he pushed through the 13th Amendment, which made slavery unconstitutional in the United States. So that was the end of it. Now, I'm not saying that was the end of racism, but clearly there was legitimate victimization of African Americans, primarily by these Southern plantation owners. But that's what, 175 years ago that ended. So you have many intervening generations now. I'm sure you've had the experience, as I have, going to a Black doctor, going to a Black lawyer. Blacks have been integrated into the United States. Now, again, I'm not saying there isn't racism. It exists. There are always dopey people around, and that is one type of doping. It's like anti-Semitism. Now, you don't hear too much of this from Jews in America because they are the richest demographic in the United States. They overwhelmingly populate, as a small percentage of the population, the ranks of the lawyers, the doctors, the accountants, the bankers, the financiers, all kinds of important places. So you don't hear too much about anti-Semitism. There is some anti-Semitism, but it's pretty hard to say that a group of people that have been more successful than any other group of people are being victimized, even though there are some people who are legitimately anti-Semitic. I think of them as just stupid people if they actually believe that. But that used to be something that was big in the United States. If you go back 50 years, there was quite a bit of anti-Semitism. So I think I answered your question.
In your experience, because I know you've worked with so many people using these scales, what would be the antidote to victimization?
The antidote was the human development work that I did with my clients. If I were to pick up a client who's at this level 6, I would work with him. And at some point, he would instantaneously jump up to level 5. And instead of being influencing people by victimization, he would be influencing them by domination. Now, you would say, that's not a nice thing. And you're right. But it's better than victimization from that guy's point of view. You have to realize this is a reversal of polarity. Right. You see, at victimization, you're pulling in all of this stuff on yourself. Oh, woe is me. I'm a victim. But in domination, it's very obviously an outflow. It reverses polarity. And you influence people by overwhelming them. This is what you find from bullies, from Nazis, from totalitarians, from people in the mafia or the KKK. They dominate. That's how they influence people. What I'm saying is, even if they're not shooting people or hanging people, this is how they control people. I, having been from New York City, before Rudy Giuliani went in there and cleaned out the mafia, I was like everyone else in New York, rubbing elbows with the mafia because they were everywhere. I bumped into these people, and yeah, they're dominating. They will overwhelm you if you give them a reason to.
Because their influence is through force.
The whole point of personal influence is they dominate you. It doesn't have to get to the point of force. This is how they work. They will come around and say, I understand you're on this jury and you don't really think Don Carlo is guilty, do you? And you say, oh, no, I don't think so. They're overwhelming you. They're saying, if you want your wife and your children to live, you're going to vote not guilty.
What I've noticed is that domination historically was much more common amongst men, but also has evolved with movements like feminism. How has the use of domination as a method of influence evolved, would you say, especially in relation to gender dynamics? And what role does it play in today's society?
You're absolutely right. I make the point in the book that this level is more predominant among men than women. And it used to be even more predominant than it is now. With feminism, you have a lot more women at this level than there used to be. In my youth, you almost never bumped into a woman who influenced people by domination. Almost never. Now, it's a cliche. But again, it's still more common among men than women. It's not as much of an imbalance as it used to be.
This is an interesting one. Aloofness. And
yes.
In brackets, you've got restraint.
Yes.
So is that an influence through withdrawal?
Yes. As you can see by the sign there, the symbol, yeah. It's an inflow. It's a withdrawal. So aloofness, as I point out in the book, has always been and still is much more common amongst women than among men. Not too many men influence people by aloofness, but women do this very well. So you see, you would have the men at 5 and women at 4. This was patently obvious amongst Victorian women. Victorian women would restrain themselves. They would not let it rip the way women do today, especially in the United States. So yes, it's a type of restraint. You restrain. And if you've ever been around somebody who does this, I've known plenty of women who did this. It's quite common. You can see it. They're aloof. That's how they influence you.
They're more withholding than forthcoming.
That's right.
In terms of a method of influence, particularly in interpersonal relationships, can you discuss the significance of it? And are there any other examples we can see in today's society?
Very often, attractive women will be at this level, going around, and the unspoken subtext is, I'm so beautiful, I don't need you, you need me. So I'm going to make no effort whatsoever to establish communication with you. I'm just going to restrain myself and allow all of you men to come after me, which is usually what happens. The more they restrain themselves, the more the men want to go after them.
If they feel more of a victim, they're more likely to say, I'm not good enough for her, or she's too beautiful, I can't approach her.
Well, of course, there are some men that are going to be at that level. But as far as the dynamic of how this works, you have very attractive women, most of whom influence people.
When we move on to using intellect and knowledge and articulation to influence, it's widespread amongst the halls of academia. In today's information-driven world, how does the method of reason characterized by intellect and knowledge continue to shape our interaction and decision-making processes?
All of these algorithms that are being used to manipulate the populace are pure reason. That is what an algorithm is. It's a type of logic. You are manipulated by Google, by Apple, by Facebook, and all these other companies, or by their clients who use them. By some kind of logic, they reach out to you and convince you of something. It's basically a sales pitch. This is what in commercials. The commercial says, would you buy a used car from this man? No, come to us. Smiling Sam, we're honest. That's a type of reason. Okay? So this is what lawyers are very good at. The good lawyers, anyway. They win you over by logic.
There's a fine line between manipulation and facilitation. I was taken aback by people queuing outside Apple stores to get the latest iPad. The engineering by targeting the dopamine receptors in the brain, I am sure that is a form of manipulation that is engineered into their marketing and advertising to seduce people, unbeknownst to them, to actually engage in this kind of activity.
Yes. I actually have a client. His practice is going to corporations and showing them how to present themselves to the world online, through television, through their logo, in a way to manipulate the people into buying the product or service. And he gets paid a lot of money. This is similar to advertising, but it's bigger. Advertising would be a subset of this. This is what you might call product design. Anyway, I'm not saying any of this is good or bad. I am saying that near the top of the scale, it's causative, and at the bottom of the scale, you are at effect. So whether or not it's good or bad, that's not up to me to say. That's a lot of the reason why this book is valuable, because it gets you away from that sort of generality. It's good, I like it. It's bad, I don't like it. That is not an insightful way to approach industrialized society.
There's no specificity to it.
That's right. Because when you utilize the data in this book, whether it's this scale or any of the other 34 scales, it goes beyond good or bad. It goes down to reality. Is a rose better than a tulip? I don't know. What does that even mean? They're very different. Okay? Now, kind of an amateur botanist, I know a lot about both, that they're very different, they have to be treated different, they have different values, but I don't think that one is better than the other. This book is about showing you this guy's a rose, this guy's a tulip, and this guy's a hydrangea, which tells you a lot about this person. There's an infinitude of things that can push a person up toward cause or down toward effect. That's going on all the time. You stub your toe, you go down a little bit toward effect. That's an effect. You did not intentionally bang your toe on the table. There's an infinitude of things like this, and this is what life consists of. When the dust settles, you are either upscale or downscale on any of these scales, and you wind up falling into one of these forms of personal influence. And it's extremely useful to spot this. I can remember many years ago when I was a student, there was another student around, a female student. She was gorgeous. And that word is not even sufficient. She was this beautiful blonde with blue eyes. And she was just like reeking aloofness. I mean, it was right there to see. Now, I did not take the bait. I'm sure she had innumerable men after her throughout her life, which is probably why she wound up at aloofness. That's her way of dealing with it, her general way of dealing with people. I'll tell you a funny story. I went out with a variety of models and singers and actresses. I lived in Hollywood for many years. And I had this girlfriend who was just shockingly beautiful. And everywhere we went, all the time, men stared at her. It was just like automatic. There was nothing you could do about it. For her birthday, I said, you know what? I'm going to take you to San Francisco for your birthday. And by the way, there was a time when San Francisco was a nice place to go. So I took her to San Francisco, right? And I didn't really think about the fact that San Francisco was like the gay capital of the world, because back then it was a very kind of a hush thing. So now we're walking around San Francisco, and I came to realize that there were all these guys staring at me. And they weren't staring at her. They were staring. It was creepy. And it was really illuminating to me about what women experience. I actually changed somewhat how I interacted with women so that they would not feel like that, objectified. So let's go up to level 2. This leadership quality.
Charisma is often associated with great leaders and performers. Can you elaborate on the role of charisma as a method of influence and how it's used by notable figures throughout history to captivate and lead others?
Either you have charisma or you don't have charisma. And that's similar to saying either you're at a certain level or you're not at a certain level, which is the whole point of this book. It is clearly a leadership manifestation. When you have charisma, you can lead. People will follow you. JFK had it. Elvis had it. Most people can't define it, but they know it when they see it. Like politically, Jack Kennedy was not much different from Bobby Kennedy, was not much different from Ted Kennedy. Jack was the one that had this overwhelming charisma. People wanted to follow him. So that's what it's about. You have this thing. I think people who are charismatic know they're charismatic, and they know that they exert some kind of an influence on people without saying anything, without doing anything, just being there.
They have this transmissive beacon of energy that seems to captivate people and brings them closer into their sphere in a way. And it's a very interesting aspect of the human. And moving into telepathy.
This is an inflow. It's like there's a vacuum there that pulls you into them in the same way that a vortex would. Now, it's worth noticing here that charisma is a higher harmonic of aloofness, and aloofness is a higher harmonic of victimization. Similarly, telepathy is a higher harmonic of reason, which is a higher harmonic of domination, which is a higher harmonic of martyrdom. So that's where the inflow-outflow comes in. These are harmonics. So if you understand physical science, that helps you get a grasp on what this phenomena is about and why it is the way it is. That's why the scale is the way it is, because it's like a stepwise thing: inflow, outflow, inflow, outflow, inflow, outflow. And after charisma, the only thing above that is telepathy. The question is, as I point out in the book, most people have telepathic abilities. Might even argue that everybody has telepathic abilities. It's a question of how much, and are they aware of it, and can they control it? When you influence somebody, that is something you intend to do. You would have to know that you're telepathic in order to influence somebody by telepathy. What do we mean by this? We mean will. You control somebody by will. Now, the easiest example to explain is, if you recall, in the original Star Wars movie, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedi, is in the speeder, which Luke is driving, and there's these two droids. And the Empire is looking for the droids. So they get to Mos Eisley spaceport, and there are soldiers there. And Obi-Wan Kenobi says, sotto voce, these are not the droids we're looking for. And the sergeant says to his comrades, these are not the droids we're looking for. So in other words, he just implanted this idea into the guy's head. I think most of the people who saw that movie understood it. I certainly did, that that's what happened. There's a little explanation after that. He talks about weak minds. Will, all right? He wanted them to not stop them, and they didn't. He didn't say anything. He didn't do anything. He just did it by telepathy. And clearly that's an outflow. You have to outflow your will into the other person. This is a real thing. Some people can do this, and that's how they influence people.
There's so many examples of it. Somebody calls you and they say, I was just thinking about you, or somebody said, I knew you were going to say that. Or we pick up on these energetic signatures that people transmit.
Yes.
And we may not see it in terms of chemistry or matter, but more as frequency. So it becomes radiational as distinct from gravitational. It's an unspoken connection, which I think is an intriguing facet of personal influence on this scale. But for people listening to this, how could they tap into their telepathic abilities to cultivate a deeper connection with others and ultimately enhancing their own personal influence in various aspects of life?
First of all, as is always the case with all scales, one can only move to an adjacent level. The only way to get to level 1 is to first be at level 2. The only way to get to level 2 is to first be at level 3. If you're at level 3, you can move to level 2. That is impossible. You have to go first to level 2. That is true for all the scales. That is one of the reasons that this book is so useful, because you find your level and then you target yourself for the next level up. Another way of answering this is, my whole career as a human development engineer, was picking up the person at the level he was at, and then using Socratic dialogue aided by biofeedback to guide him to lift himself up to the next level. I didn't do it. He did it. I just asked the right question and used the biofeedback to have insight into the person. So that's how I discovered this material, by doing that thousands and thousands of times. I don't know how many thousands of times, because this went on for 40 years. So I just made notes. And eventually that's how I discovered the scales. And when we had our first discussion, I think I explained that whole history of how that came about. There's no simple answer to how you become telepathic. I would say first you have to be at level 2 before you can get to level 1. If you're not at level 2, then you have to work your way up. That's true for all the scales. So that is why any type of facilitation or psychotherapy is aimed at moving people up these scales, even though the facilitator or the psychotherapist might not know that these scales even exist. He's trying to improve the person. And to the degree that he succeeds, the person will move up these scales, all 35 scales.
I would imagine that going from one part of the scale to the next part of the scales, from victimization to domination to aloofness to reason, that not all of those steps are equivalent. Would that be correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by steps. This is a quantum scale. You're at level 5, and then a billionth of a second later, you're at level 4.
Okay, I understand.
There's no intervening gradation, because the way it happens is by epiphany, which is what guided my work. I was looking for the epiphany. The guy was saying, oh, wait a minute, I just realized my mother is just my first grade teacher. He has this realization. And then suddenly he understands his mother, and the relationship is better. It's instantaneous.
It's a quantum jump. I get it.
Yeah. And
Thank you for that.
There are many scales that are not quantum scales. They're gradual scales.
Yes.
Which is more intuitive for most people to understand, where you go by millimeter up from 4 to 3 or whatever. But let me just say this. The most important, the most major theme in human history is freedom. That's why wars are fought. That's why political campaigns are fought. People give billions and billions of dollars to political campaigns because they want freedom of one type or another. What is freedom? Nobody ever bothers to define it. Freedom is the power to choose. If you can choose, you're free. So you have a guy, he's in prison. He's in this cell. He can't go out for a walk. He can't go out for a drive. He can't go out for ice cream, right? He does not have those choices. His choice has been taken away from him because he's in jail. So he doesn't have freedom because he doesn't have choice. But he can choose how to think. I'm just giving that as an example of what I mean by power of choice. The whole idea of cognitive therapy is that you have power over how you think about something. And in a sense, you choose how you're going to deal with something or relate to something. And that's what the scale is about. It gives the 7 levels. This is extremely important to understand. And there's a lot that goes into it. Before we close, I just want to invite your viewers, if they're interested in Septemics, go to my website, septemics.com, where you can see what many readers have said about it, what many journalists have written about it, what the reviews are. You can read sections of the book itself. And if you're interested, you can listen to a pre-recorded introduction to Septemics by yours truly.
Jim, thank you so much.